From significant world-altering events, we're told that history matters and why it matters every day by the media. They always tell us exactly what we're supposed to think and what historical events we're supposed to consider. And today in this exploration, we're going to look at the history they want you to forget.
You were sleeping. You slept too long. We all have. It's time we woke. Time we stopped running.
Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, the date which will live in infamy. The surprise attack by the Japanese on the United States military in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. This is an event that has long been recollected, and yet to this day Americans still seek answers for how the United States military was caught by surprise in Pearl Harbor. The attack was devastating, killing over 2,400 Americans, sinking 4 battleships, and damaging numerous others. The surprise attack, though, was not without warning, contrary to what many would think. There was a Japanese submarine that was destroyed outside of Pearl Harbor prior to the attack. And indeed, Admiral Kimmel, the U.S. commander at Pearl Harbor, had sent his carriers sailing westward to respond to Japanese aggression at the time. The USS Arizona Memorial, pictured here, responsible for over 1,000 sailors that were killed when an ammunition magazine exploded on the battleship. Many others were destroyed or damaged, and yet Pearl Harbor did have someone who warned of it. The U.S. Army Air Force General Billy Mitchell, who commanded all American air units in France and proved that bombs could destroy heavily armed naval ships, and was subsequently court-martialed for insubordination, suggesting that the military was not prepared for aviation warfare. As part of his defense, it was indicated that there was a plan to defend Oahu or Pearl Harbor from Japanese attack in 1923. It should also be noted that Billy Mitchell, after he resigned, when he was found guilty in his court-martial, spoke to President Roosevelt, and he spoke to him about the dangers of aviation attack on battleships, and also on the fact that the United States military should be formed as a Department of Defense. President Roosevelt did not appoint Billy Mitchell to Secretary of any military as he had hoped, but he was clearly well informed of the capabilities of aviation warfare and knew of the danger to the heavily armed battleships in the Pacific Theater of Operations. Regardless of what the real explanation was, the attempts by many Americans to try to determine if there was some sort of pre-war knowledge that the Japanese were going to attack the U.S. fleet in Pearl Harbor is considered an unfounded conspiracy theory. And it is a fact to say that there is no direct evidence. There is certainly no presidential directive that stated that the United States military was going to be set up to be attacked in the Pacific. However, it is interesting to consider the fact that there were numerous actions that warned of Japanese aggression. The United States military did acknowledge in Billy Mitchell's court-martial that it had a plan to defend Pearl Harbor and the island of Oahu from Japanese attack as early as 1923. And you can always say, well, just because they had a plan, that doesn't mean they were prepared to execute it very well. It doesn't necessarily prove anything. The Pacific Theater of Operations was a very extensive theater of operations, covering vast tracts of ocean, very difficult to support logistically, and yet the Japanese had planned and executed a surprise attack that was very successful. Fortuitously, the U.S. carriers Lexington, Saratoga, and Enterprise were not in port at the time and had been sent sailing westward by the U.S. commander, Admiral Kimmel, and therefore the actual center of gravity, or the doer, for all military operations was saved. Yes, the United States Navy lost several battleships, but it was a new form of war in the Pacific Ocean, and therefore their carriers were saved. However, the American military commanders Admiral Kimmel and General Short were relieved of command, found responsible for being unprepared for the surprise attack by the Japanese. Although it should be noted that Admiral Kimmel's predecessor had warned of a possible Japanese attack. Admiral Richardson, who had warned President Roosevelt that the Japanese could easily attack the United States fleet if it was based at Pearl Harbor, and suggested basing it on the west coast of the United States. In fact, Admiral Richardson was so adamant about this that he lost his position and was relieved of command and replaced by Admiral Kimmel. Indeed, the subsequent disaster of the sinking of the Royal Navy ships Prince of Wales and Repulse being caught in the South China Sea without air cover proved that Billy Mitchell and Admiral Richardson were correct. Even the great General Douglas MacArthur, American military genius, was caught unprepared with his airplanes on the ground in the Philippines on Clark Airfield 9 hours after Pearl Harbor. Chief of Staff of the Army George C. Marshall said he didn't know how MacArthur was caught by surprise. Yet the United States military would recover from these surprise attacks and produce the great military machine with over 24 Essex-class carriers, started construction in 1941. It should also be noted that President Roosevelt was not considered responsible. He had no forewarned knowledge of the attack. He had acted on George C. Marshall's recommendation to increase the defenses and early warning of the West Coast United States, but he did not act on Admiral Richardson's recommendation to post the fleet on the West Coast and relieved him of command for doing so. And indeed, Billy Mitchell's recommendation for the danger of battleships to air attack without air cover seems to have been ignored as well. Jason Robards in the special said that some historical events just happen and they have no single cause. Is that really the case? Or is the actual history behind the United States military surprise in Pearl Harbor history they want you to forget? U.S. taxes. Taxes are contentious in the United States, and yet it's something that both diametrically opposed political parties always seem to be able to agree on without fail when it comes to actually raising funds to run the United States government. In fact, the very origin of the United States is rooted in a tax revolt. In fact, the imposition of taxes such as the Sugar Act, the Tea Act, and the famous Stamp Act is what we're told incited the American Revolution. The famous saying, taxation without representation. The United States starting as a series of British colonies that were being exploited simply to enrich the royalty in Great Britain. And therefore this led to the American Revolution. The righteous American Revolution with the genius political polymaths, the founding fathers of the United States, who not only were they able to defeat Great Britain, the greatest military at that time, on the land in the United States, but also managed to conjure up a brilliant document, the United States Constitution. And granted, they didn't have federal taxes at the time during the American Revolution, or else you would have seen Washington and his army wearing reflective belts, as is captured in this image, and perhaps they would have done even better when they crossed the Delaware. But it was not needed, as the United States Army had uniforms, and even though being a nascent nation and a nascent military, achieved success. The wondrous founding fathers managed to conjure up the greatest document, the high law of the land, the United States Constitution, beginning with the famous words, "We the people." And yet it all came from a revolution against taxation without representation. Yet in Pennsylvania, there were whiskey farmers who were suddenly finding themselves taxed over their whiskey in order to pay the debts that were incurred by the revolution, no doubt to make all those wondrous uniforms, although remember they didn't have reflective belts. The Whiskey Rebellion, as it was called, was considered one of the first tests of the United States Constitution, as it was an attempt by the farmers to evade paying taxes. President Washington himself rallied the militias and gathered a large military force to go to Pennsylvania and resolve this failure to pay taxes, which was achieved, and the Whiskey Rebellion, as it was called, was subsequently put down, and the United States Constitution was defended. Federal income taxes eventually came about with President Lincoln signing the first U.S. personal income tax into law in order to pay for the Great United States Civil War, because the United States could not sort out its own political divisions and had to decide them by war. And indeed, this first federal income tax was contentious at the time, but it was not renewed 10 years after the Civil War, and so there was no longer any federal income tax. However, the income tax would not go away. And in the early 1900s, finally a provision for tax on income is part of the Constitution, and it was passed after the proposal by Senator Brown to pass an income tax. And to this day, the United States has a federal income tax. Oddly enough, proposed by Senator Brown, who was a member of the Republican Party, the only political party we're told that did not favor the passage of an income tax, and yet somehow a Republican proposed it, and it was passed. There are other strange anomalies, though, concerning the imposition of the federal income tax. The fact that the political parties are always attributed for bringing up notions, but it always seems to be the opposite political party that oftentimes suggests them for passage. But perhaps that's just the way politics works in the United States. It's not indicative of anything. Go back to the Little House on the Prairie episode Centennial, where Paul and his family are complaining about the fact that they only pay property taxes at that time. And even with just these property taxes, Paul is unable, according to the dialogue in the episode, to even make a living or bring about a better living for his own family. Keep in mind, this was before they passed the federal income tax. The episode centers around our poor sod, guest star, played by Austrian actor Theodor Beikel, as a Russian immigrant who finds himself purchasing a house that still had property taxes owned on it. At the end of the episode, he loses the house, and of course he says he was the one who was stupid. It wasn't the government's fault that he didn't know about the taxes owed on the house, and we never see his character again. But it is a stark reminder about what property taxes really mean. Do you really own anything in terms of property if you actually have to pay taxes on it? That's a philosophical and a rhetorical question. The actual origin of property taxes in the United States is something that's always been around. It was never passed by the democratic process or the constitutional republic we have. You have to have some way to pay for trillion-dollar and billion-dollar planes over time. Or the origin of property taxes is simply history they would like you to forget. The Battle of Los Angeles. In 1942, shortly after the surprise Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and the subsequent, not so surprising yet successful attack on Clark Field in the Philippines, the United States found itself in a state of what would be called war paranoia. There were vast increases to the defense expenditure, and people were fearing the potential of Japanese attack on the west coast of the United States. The United States responded quickly by establishing many anti-aircraft units on the west coast United States, and it was prepared to respond to any Japanese aggression. There would be no more surprise attacks after all the successful surprise attacks of December 1941. There were many images, though, that showed that what was declared a lost weather balloon had flown over Los Angeles, and as a result of the paranoid nature at the time, nearly every anti-aircraft battery and many civilians joined in firing at this lost weather balloon. Quite interesting, though, that there was a weather balloon that was flying this close to the ground, but I suppose it's possible. However, one of our journalist friends with the LA Times tells us that this is something that ufologists should have never considered a possible unidentified flying object because it lacks credibility. It's always interesting to me, though, that journalists are the ones that are making these final conclusions, even though we're told by our authority figures that we trust that only historians and scientists can actually make these determinations. Yet somehow it always seems to be journalists who tell us the final conclusion of what really happened, and perhaps that's because since journalists are not historians and scientists, they don't need to have that credibility of speculating in terms of what's a conspiracy theory, and what the true events are. The Battle of Los Angeles was considered merely an event that showed how overly prepared and overly eager the individuals manning the anti-aircraft guns really were, and it indeed resulted in a feeling of fear and panic that continued to sweep the west coast of the United States long after it happened. There was never any final conclusion in terms of what the object was, and there's even statements that the pictures of the object that the anti-aircraft guns fired upon that evening was, again, just a lost weather balloon. Although the legend of the Battle of Los Angeles endured within the collective conscience of the United States for some time to come. Indeed, there was even a science fiction movie that was based on the Battle of Los Angeles, which, again, our aforementioned journalist tried to say that they had merely augmented the actual photos of the real Battle of Los Angeles in 1942, and therefore they were misinterpreted as representing some sort of unidentified flying object. Whatever the situation really was, though, whether this was an unidentified flying object, a weather balloon as we're told, or something else completely different, it is intriguing that such a profound psychological effect would be rooted in the collective conscience of Americans. And at the same time, the media would always have to weigh in terms of what it really was. And of course, we are always counted upon to turn into the media to tell us what the final conclusion of events really are, whether they're one thing one day and they change to something else the other day. We could even consult the United States Air Force and look at their aircraft identification chart, and we can see that there is no doubt that the object that we saw in the picture is most certainly a weather balloon. About the only thing that we could really rule out was swamp gas. Whatever it really was, all kidding aside, it does seem to have promoted the era and the feeling of fear that was present in the United States at the time on the West Coast, and it stayed with many Americans. Considering the fact that UFOs were a phenomenon that came after the war, and also the realistic fact that several Japanese submarines had even attacked the west coast of the United States. And even after the Battle of Los Angeles, later in World War II, the Japanese had balloons that they had attempted to attack the United States with. One balloon had even exploded and resulted in the death of several Americans. And so it seems that there really was a legitimate threat that necessitated the Battle of Los Angeles. And yet, at the same conclusion, these individuals that manned these aircraft guns were considered paranoid. So once again, we have a situation with conflict. What was the Battle of Los Angeles really? Was it just now an over-alert military that only a few months earlier had been caught completely unprepared, even though we acknowledged earlier that Japanese intentions were well known and that there was a plan to defend Oahu and Hawaii as early as 1923 from Japanese aggression? There's also the aspect of what are weather balloons? perhaps it's all just pie in the sky, or pigs in the sky, that there's really nothing up in the sky and we just need to believe exactly what we're told. Or the Battle of Los Angeles is simply history they'd like you to forget. Finally, we go to Operation Ajax. The intervention of Western nations in the Middle East is something that was a byproduct after World War II. Indeed, the United States had inclinations to intervene in the Middle East in order to secure its supply of oil. And that's oftentimes the official reason given for the United States interventions in the Middle East. However, Operation Ajax involved the complete removal of a democratically elected government in Iran. Operation Ajax was a CIA operation that was overseen by Kermit Roosevelt Jr. Yes, another Roosevelt. And remember that Roosevelts are only responsible for American successes. They are never responsible for American failures. I would dare say that's a historical fact. Kermit Roosevelt had reported to the United States and the Eisenhower administration that the democratically elected regime in Iran was going to show more favor to the communist nations, or the Eastern Bloc at that time. This was early in the Cold War. And Kermit Roosevelt recommended that the Shah of Iran be placed in power, and that the democratically elected government be removed of power. The Eisenhower administration approved this action, and the CIA soon set about rising and arousing fervor within Iran to actually act against their own democratically elected government. Now, there's conflicting accounts in terms of what really happened and how involved the CIA actually was, and whether the people of Iran actually supported their democratically elected government or they didn't. It's safe to say, though, that in subsequent events after the revolution which put the Shah in power, that Iran did not appreciate the American intervention in their internal affairs. And interestingly enough, it seems as though the American intervention in Iran's internal affairs was very well known. And many would ask the question how such a competent and experienced organization such as the Central Intelligence Agency would allow their intervention within Iranian internal affairs to be so well known. And it's even more strange when we look at the actual advent of the initial revolution. Oddly enough, the United States would depend upon the Shah for nearly 20 years after the revolution, and then suddenly find the Shah rapidly deposed of power in the late 1970s in what was considered a great intelligence failure. And this would subsequently lead to the Iran hostage crisis and the perception that the United States had lost much of its foreign capability. And indeed, the United States was humiliated by the hostage crisis when the Iranian revolutionaries in 1979 had seized the United States embassy and had taken the entire embassy staff hostage. And yet oftentimes this contentious event is something that's hand-waved away in the fact that the United States had actually started this by intervening in Iran's internal affairs. The hostage crisis actually led to the advent of more journalism in the United States, with the start of the show of Nightline and the constant update in terms of the hostage crisis. And of course, the individual who bore no responsibility for this, who had left the CIA after Operation Ajax, Kermit Roosevelt Jr. Now, you might be going back to, how is it that the Iranians were so well aware of the United States intervention within their internal affairs? The CIA is supposed to be a covert agency, and therefore you would think that they would be able to conduct intervening in the internal affairs of nations with more subterfuge. The Iranian hostage crisis reminded, though, that there was a difficulty in terms of imposing these revolutions. But how was it the legendary Kermit Roosevelt Jr. and the great United States Central Intelligence Agency left the signature of their intervening in Iranian internal affairs? How was it that the people of Iran were aware that the United States was responsible for removing their democratically elected government and then essentially imposing what many Iranians saw as a dictator in terms of the Shah, who needed to be overthrown in the late 1970s, from their perception? Well, we can actually go and look into the CIA documents itself, on the CIA website itself. And it discusses how, during this great revolution, when they were removing Iran's democratically elected leader, that Kermit Roosevelt Jr. and indeed the staff of the American Embassy were looking for some patriotic music to play during their chosen individual's speech, and they ended up playing the Star-Spangled Banner. I suppose that's one way of showing the Iranians that the United States was behind the revolution all along. They could have played Stars and Stripes forever. Remember how much that annoyed Captain Picard? Apparently, playing Stars and Stripes Forever or the Star Spangled Banner is more history they'd like you to forget.
I'd love to stay, but